If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
If you live in St. Louis or St. Louis County, chances are high that you know a lot about Congressman Lacy Clay, but you probably don't know much about his Republican opponent this year. That will change as Republican Steve Bailey joins us next on another edition of Politically Speaking.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I think that is fair to say.
Hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
It's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in our St. Louis studios, my co-host.
Yes, fellow St. Louis Public Radio reporter, Joe Mannies.
And our special guest we have in studio,
Steve Bailey, Republican candidate for Congress.
You are the Republican candidate in the 1st Congressional District?
In the 1st Congressional District, opposing Lacy Clay. The Clay family has held that office for 48 years.
Yes.
And when I talk to people on the street, they're kind of shocked that it's been that long.
It's longer than I've been alive.
Time flies.
But I'm sure the congressman sees that as a point of pride.
Correct. Now, for our listeners, we just had the congressman on. It's been on our website just a couple days. So if you're listening to this one, which will be a good show, I'm sure, after you're finished, if you want to listen to the Congressman Clay, you can pull that up and listen to that one as well.
We want everybody in St. Louis and St. Louis County to get a good perspective on this contest. Before we get into the machinations of this race, tell our listeners a little about yourself, kind of your professional background, and why you decided to run for this seat at all.
Well, I'm an attorney. I was trained down at SIU Carbondale. My family grew up in Edwardsville. I was born way out in Utah when we spent time in Brazil.
Where in Utah?
Provo.
Oh, okay.
My dad was on the faculty at Brigham Young.
And Brazil, the country, or Brazil, the town?
Brazil, the country.
Wow. Wow.
It's kind of like, one day in Indiana, I went to Brazil, Peru, and Paris.
Yeah.
Paris, Illinois, Brazil, and Peru, Indiana.
I don't know if
I'm
you know,
from Indiana. So I know that.
Joe is from Indiana, so the fact that Mike Pence is on the ballot must be a field day in the sense that Indiana is in the spotlight, not for any political
Well,
reason.
actually, I mean, I don't know him personally, but I know some of his relatives. I actually went to high school.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
Wow,
yes.
wow.
Yes, because he is from the same part of Indiana where I grew up. I mean,
Wow.
the same general area.
Well, and Mitch Daniels is become a modern hero of mine.
Oh, yeah?
I really like what Daniels does. I love his editorials in the Wall Street Journal. Anyway, to finish it out, Dad had a dollar diplomacy job down in Brazil and spent about 5.5 years there. But his next duty assignment would have been Saigon. Mm-hmm. And he had 4 small children. He was lucky enough to land a faculty job at SIU Edwardsville. And so I went all the way through. So I'm kind of an Illinois kid, but I married about 20 years ago a young doctor, and her practice was in Missouri. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty easy for a lawyer to cross the river and continue my practice in Illinois.
What's your specialty?
As an attorney, I was a personal injury lawyer. I worked both insurance defense and I did plaintiff's personal injury primarily for railroad workers.
Okay. Yeah. I got to just ask because Illinois has a reputation of being pretty friendly to trial attorneys and attorneys in general. Did you get a sense that it was easier to operate there than Missouri? But Missouri had a different set of laws back when you practiced, I would imagine. So was it basically about the same?
They're very similar. The city of St. Louis is also a relatively liberal jurisdiction. In fact, in terms of railroad litigation, it's one of the best places to file a railroad case in the United States. It's right up there with Brownsville, Texas, some of the others. Juries are really pretty good, and the laws are good. And what I found amazing was that there's a tremendous amount of U.S. Supreme Court and Missouri Supreme Court law that is used nationwide on the FELA.
Wow. That's something I honestly didn't know, and I know a lot.
I didn't know it till I walked in and had to do research on the Switchman's Act, and I've forgotten the name of it.
Yeah, because actually, my grandfather and my step-grandfather were both big railroad guys. Because I said Indiana, my birthplace is Peru, Indiana, where Cole Porter was born, but also that was a railroad hub, way back in the day in the early 1900s up to World War II. So a little history there. Jason's going crazy. Okay, so tell us, what prompted you to run for office?
Oh, but before we get there, what are you doing right now? Because I know that you haven't practiced law in a while.
Yeah, I kind of stopped practicing law about 20 years into the practice of law, or 22 years into it, and got a job at UMSL teaching life insurance. And started teaching life insurance about 2 weeks before September 11th of 2001. So one of my first experiences coming onto the campus was coming in and there were no planes in the sky when we used to have two dropping in about every 3 minutes.
Yes, because it's very close to Lambert.
Very close to Lambert. And, I didn't know it as I was flying in, but that campus can be seen out the port side or the left side of an airplane.
Yeah, that's
as
true.
You land.
That's true.
Yeah. So now, Joe, you can ask the questions.
Okay, this is a freewheeling show today.
That's good.
Okay, which is good. Okay, so what prompted you? I mean, from your field to decide, hey, I'm going to run for office.
Well,
and have you been in any other offices before, so our listeners know?
No, and I've tried to make a Ronald Reagan type statement about, I won't hold that against my opponent. But no, I have never held a real political office. I mean, I've been a leader in a lot of civic organizations, Cub Scouts, local church organizations. But always in the back of my mind, I've harbored some desire to make a big political splash, I guess. And Congress is something that I have sort of trained for. I worry deeply about our federal government and its overreach into state and local business. We're not getting the separation of powers that we should ordinarily under the Constitution. The Congress has repeatedly taken hot-button issues and transferred them to the executive, and then the executive runs roughshod, if you will, through administrative deals, and the courts defer to almost every administrative activity.
Now, because you are a lawyer, is there anything particular about your expertise that you think would be a particular strength if you're elected to Congress?
Well, certainly the construction of statutes and the interpretation of statutes is a strength of mine. If I were to talk at the tax code level, almost nobody can unwind that. I studied it heavily in law school, and my professor sort of jokingly referred to this one section that had 733 words, 7 semicolons, 4 colons, 17 commas, and not a single period. And, his idea was, you can do almost anything you want to because there's no way anybody can figure this out.
That is an incredibly long sentence. Like, it's almost a nightmarish sentence. I'm almost scared after you told me that.
Well, and that's typical of the code. I'm not certain. I would love to. One of the things I think we need in the United States is a repealer session. Mm-hmm. This used to be a standard in the state legislatures.
You mean where they would go through and repeal stuff?
They go back in and just look at what is not working. Where can we modify? Instead of just continuously bringing new law on board, and then it brings on new regulation. And, the average worker, the average individual doesn't know what the laws are.
Now, when you decided to run for office, you did have a contested primary.
Yes.
I actually covered the league forum before the primary, which had everybody. Was there anything particular about the primary that you think will help you now as you go to the general? And what sort of support are you getting from the area Republican organizations?
Well, most of the local committee people are very aware of me. The North County Republicans in particular, I've been able to go to. I've got to get into the city. I'm planning to go next Wednesday is their next regular meeting. I appeared at the Clayton Township
meeting.
They had a picnic in Tellis Park and gave a speech on privatization of a portion of Social Security, which was really pretty well received. You know, the idea is that if we could give each individual, if they want it, 4.4% of Social Security to manage on their own, we wouldn't be stuck in a 1.1% yielding T-bill account, which is what we're defaulted to in Social Security. And it's part of why we have a Social Security crisis, is that the choice of investments for individuals is so limited, and we let that be run away. I don't know if I'm answering the question.
No, you're doing it quite well.
That's actually pretty interesting. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the Republicans in the first congressional district, because it's a good segue into this. I actually was at the first district caucus, and Joe, I think, was at the second district when the delegates were chosen. And I guess this wasn't surprising to me because I know the makeup of the first congressional district. It's a heavily Democratic district. I think you know what you're getting into there. But I just noticed, like, as far as, like, luminaries in this district who are, like, in actual elected office, I counted 2. I counted James Knowles III of Ferguson and a council person, I think, in St. Anne, who's running for county council. That's it. Everybody else is kind of on the grassroots activist level. When you compare it to the first district for the Democrats, there are so many elected officials there that
there were too many to fill the slots.
Right.
I mean, have you gotten a sense that reality makes getting your name out difficult? Because I think you know what you're getting into. This is a heavily Democratic district, but even when you know that, you probably encounter how challenging it is just from looking at the grassroots organizational standpoint. What's kind of your take on that?
Well, if we were to look at the city Republican Party, for instance, I think about half of the wards don't have a committeeman.
Yeah.
That's roughly, and I don't know that that's current. They shift in and out. When I looked in July, there were only about a fourth of the wards that didn't have one. But when I looked again after the election in August, it would look like almost half had not been filled. In terms of getting my reach out, it's not a heavily funded campaign. My opponent has $400,000, and I've spent a little under $5,000 of my dollars thus far myself. Going primarily door to door, talking to people. That's been an effective campaign tool. It's essentially what I did in the primary, and I won that by a 2-to-1 margin.
It's interesting because I live in Southwest St. Louis City, and there actually are a lot of Republicans that live in places like St. Louis Hills or the 12th Ward, the 23rd Ward, even like the 11th and 13th Ward. I just haven't seen, though, like a very organized Republican presence there. Like Donna Behringer, who's my alderwoman, is going to become a state representative. She has a Republican opponent, but she's going to win.
Right.
And I would say that would be a good opportunity for a Republican to get in that race and get 40 or 45% of the vote. But ever since I've lived there, they've never fielded a Republican candidate there, even in Republican parts of the city. Why do you think that is? Because that seems like there's opportunities there for Republicans to at least be competitive, if not gain ground.
You'd have to ask a lot of other people. I started out life as a Hubert Humphrey Democrat.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. So what was your come to change moment?
Come to Goldwater moment, so to speak.
Well, I don't know that I'd go quite as far as Barry Goldwater, but I certainly go to a Howard Baker tradition, a Lowell Weicker tradition.
Okay.
To name people in the Watergate affair. As a Democrat, I was always tempted to vote for Reagan. I'd go to the polls and I've always been I'm a good yellow dog Democrat. But what I heard from Reagan, I really liked.
So did you switch while Reagan was president?
No. In fact, I was not a big Bush fan, but I was slowly drifting.
Bush 1 or Bush 2?
Bush 2. I was slowly drifting in that direction. And I'm probably counting myself as about 10 years. I've been much more solidly Republican.
So we mentioned on the outset of the show that the Clay family has held this seat for about 50 years, 48 years.
48 years.
Interestingly, State Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal, who primaried Congressman Clay, brought this up too during her primary campaign, that just having almost 50 years of the same family holding a seat was excessive in her view. Obviously, the primary voters had a different opinion. Why do you think that it's a bad thing that they've had this continued service? Because I'm sure that Congressman Clay would say, my dad was a successful congressman. I know what I'm doing because I've had all of this political experience. What would you say to that argument, and why do you think it might be a negative?
Well, it's 1/5 of the existence of the United States of America. If we look at 240-year existence of the country, which dates us to 1776, it's precisely 1/5 of that. If I were to compare them to the Adams family, John and John Quincy, John Adams was a representative, ambassador to England, ambassador to France. His son, John Quincy, a very able statesman, I believe was an ambassador to 5 different countries.
Yes, including Russia, yeah.
Right. there aren't many good biographies on him. I've looked for one, but I haven't found one because he's a fascinating man. When he appears in other people's biographies, he really kind of rocks the boat,
Very
if you will.
much so.
Very competent, kind of John Jay-like character.
Well, he went back after he was president to be in
And he did
the
8 years in
House.
Congress, didn't he?
Yeah, yes, he did, and he had this seat. They even have a little spot there, where in the old chamber, if you stand there, you can hear anybody whispering anywhere in the chamber, and that was not intentional. But then they realized that's how come the old guy knew what everybody was saying. He was outmaneuvering.
And let's be honest, America might have been better if, Quincy Adams would have won re-election and Andrew Jackson never became president. But that's for another podcast.
But I'm with you there. He's one of our first autocratic presidents.
Yeah.
He's very different from Washington.
And he had a brilliant wife, but that's another show.
Yes,
too.
well,
Are we talking about Jackson here or
Quincy.
Adams? Who are
Quincy
you talking
Quincy Adams. Well,
Quincy Adams' wife was brilliant.
his mother is a phenomenal character, Abigail Adams.
But I believe when you were talking about the autocratic president, he was referring to Jackson.
I was referring to Jackson.
He was.
But go
So
getting back
if
to
we're
the Clay
looking at the
parts.
Clay family, it's been congressman.
So are you comparing? Now you're not comparing them
Congressman,
to Jackson.
Well, the Clay family locally. Oh, to Jackson?
Yeah.
Oh no.
Okay.
No.
Okay,
I'm
but go
trying
ahead.
to draw a comparison between great American families, the Clay family and the Adams family.
Okay.
The Adams have served in a variety of, so it's sort of like John Calhoun, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay.
John Calhoun was a senator. He was also a congressman. He was also the vice president. He never was. I think he was. I can't make it through his biographies. They're abysmal.
He became senator. He actually resigned from being vice president and became senator again.
Went back to being a senator.
Yeah. But continue.
Anyway, that's a little more in our tradition. It's one of the reasons I ran against Gephardt in '98 was that he had held that seat for, I believe, 22 years. And we just get these uninterrupted congressmen when the intent of the Constitutional Convention on a 2-year seat is maybe 8 years at the outside. It's, and the party's used to, like Lincoln was elected for 2 years, and the party told him he couldn't run again, even though he was a very effective congressman.
So are you advocating term limits for
Not
Congress?
at all. We have them in the Constitution. You have to vote them out.
Right. So okay. So as what sort of campaigning are you doing?
Well, what I've mostly been doing is going door to door. I've got Facebook and Twitter going. I'm not making big hits in those necessarily. And slowly building interest in those. I think my Twitter account is pretty good, although the Twitter sometimes leads to not the best comments from an individual.
So are you planning, or have you been able to raise enough money to do any sort of advertising
No.
or mailers? Okay, so it's
So
basically
it's door to door with handmade, FedEx Kinko copied flyers and talking face to face to people.
So no talking mailers.
yeah.
No.
That's an allusion to Russ Carnahan's 2012 race where he literally mailed out mailers
Yes.
that talk to you.
Yeah, yes.
It's,
Oh, really?
It's
Yeah,
a,
that's a whole nother.
it's a running gag.
But it's true. It's true. I actually did a big
No, so
story
I've
on it at
mostly
the
been
time.
going door to door. That's what I did in the primary. I'm amping up some of the appearances. I was hoping that we would have a League of Women Voters Forum with Congressman Clay, but he got back to them and said he was too busy for that.
Yeah. So let's kind of segue into issues because you are the underdog in this race.
Absolutely.
I think Congressman Clay is heavily favored. Through no fault of your own, the district is just very, very Democratic.
Right.
So what are your key issues? And, I mean, what are you really hitting him on? I mean, aside from the fact the family's been, has represented the district for a long time, are there particular positions that you're saying are wrong, or just kind of what's your key pitch to people?
Well, my key pitch to a lot of people is that he touts himself as a progressive, but if we look at the north side, we certainly aren't making great progress there. We're seeing a regression, unfortunately. I was at Blair and Grand last Friday. I used to work near there, and it has lost probably 30 to 40% of the buildings, and that's probably an underestimate. There were little small pockets of ability. The big things that I'm concerned are youth unemployment in the ghetto, if you will, or in the hood. We've got a 17%. This is something Maria Chappelle-Negral talked about, too.
She's the state senator who challenged Clay in the primary and lost.
Right. And but we have a 24.1% young black male unemployment rate. And I don't know exactly where the cause of this is, but I would trace it back to education failures of a sort. One of the things I'd like us to see us do is amp up mentoring or take some kids who are just not academic learners. They're better off in the shop class or whatever, or a sewing class. I'm not real sure. I'm not real good on what girls want to do for a living. Maybe I shouldn't admit that, but, what guys want to do, and a lot of times is build stuff and do kinesthetic things. But they're not getting basic algebra skills, basic reading skills, basic literacy skills, communication skills. I'm also very concerned with our deep homeless population.
Well, these things are definitely problems, but they seem like things that you would fix on a local level, not Congress. Have you thought that maybe you should turn your attention there instead of running for Congress? I mean, where do you live, first of all?
I live in Clayton.
So you obviously can't obviously do that. But I mean, can you answer my point, though?
Yeah, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly, that the federal government, in fact, if we read the Constitution, guess what word never appears?
What?
Education. Article 1, Section 8 is very explicit
so
about
are you
what
saying,
powers.
Would you want to get rid of the Department of Education?
I would love to see us downsize that and shrink it.
So,
Hugely. I'd rather put this back to the states. I like what the Republicans did, even though it's claimed they did nothing over the summer, that they actually returned a lot of money to the states in terms of you guys do what you want to with this federal money.
So what role, because you mentioned some of the concerns, as Jason pointed out, what do you think Congress can do regarding any of those? Or is your job to have Congress do less regarding those issues so that the local and state governments do more? Just what's your...
Well, a couple of places we might be able to work through Congress are things like bringing back a form of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, to help rebuild cities or to straighten out neighborhoods. My plan, I call it a 256 plan, and it's 2 to the 8th, I think, is 256. If we can get 2 people together, they become 4, they become 8, they become 16. We just kind of multiply effect in neighborhoods. And we might be able, through mentoring and other like ideas, get young people job skills. Whether it's the social skill of showing up on time, being courteous, being appropriately dressed, the other option is in the homeless community. I think we've made a mistake, from what I can gather, going back to the Kennedy administration, moving away from state hospitals for some people, and certainly Reagan compounded this.
Yeah, that was a big thing under Reagan, because that's when a lot of Missouri's facilities, Kit Bond was governor, and that's when a lot of that was downsized. Just just an editorial thing.
No, but I think we need to editorialize on that because we were all screaming out here in the trenches, this is going to just lead to rampant homelessness, and it has. You know, we're underserving a population that we're called upon to serve. You know, if we're able-bodied and healthy and you know, I think Matt Holliday says, you know, those to whom God has given great gifts, much is expected.
So if you were in Congress, how would you address any of this?
Well, I would try to find a constituency, and I think we have it now in Paul Ryan and some of the other leaders, that we need to get into the inner cities and begin working on how do we make this education system better. One of them is how do we maybe get pressure on local authorities to begin working on school choice.
Well, I mean, I have to ask this question because the 1st Congressional District is a majority African-American district. And even though there are instances throughout Congress where white people like yourself represent African-American areas,
Sure.
Steve Cohen in Memphis, how are you going to be able to, like, how are you going to be able to basically exert political influence or political authority when many African Americans may want an African American in this seat? I mean, the first district, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, there was a long battle in Missouri to make sure that the 1st Congressional District had a majority African American population so there'd be African American representation there.
Yes, this goes back to the Voting Rights Act. I mean, way back. Yes.
So can you address those concerns? Because, again, we know the realities of this district. It's heavily Democratic, but I think that there is also kind of a racial and a racial justice component to why this district exists, essentially.
Well, there was a young man who stood on the Lakeland Memorial in 1964 and talked about all God's children. And that resonates extremely well in the African American community. Do I have a long list of African American friends? No, I do not. But when I go into the neighborhoods and I talk to people face to face, I would say somewhere around 2 out of 5 of them react very favorably to me. I went into Moline Anchors. A friend of mine brought me into there to a cancer awareness event, and I was able to talk face to face with a number of people, and they were deeply engaged with me.
Yeah.
I think that if we look at what we're getting from our African American representative relative to the African American community, Abraham Lincoln was not a black man, and that's who founded our party.
Yeah, but I think there's been
our greatest progressive was Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And again, there are instances where a white person would represent an African-American district and vice versa. Shamed Dogan, who's a state representative in Baldwin, is African-American. His district is primarily white, and he's African-American. I'm not saying, like, you can't have that scenario, but I think that there has been a long-running battle to make sure that there is African-American representation in levels of legislative government, and that's why places like the 1st Congressional District were created. And that's probably why, Russ Carnahan wasn't successful when he primaried Lacey Clay, because I think a lot of ordinary people, along with political leaders, wanted to keep that going, essentially.
There's probably more resistance in University City to a white man representing the district than in any other community in the district.
Well, I mean, are you finding that out going door to door, or what?
Yes.
How come?
I found that out. Because I've been told face to face that we really think we need to have a black man running this. And that's contrary to the teachings of Dr. King. We're judging people by the color of their skin, not the content of their character. And, judge me by the content of my character. Yeah, there is always going to be some resistance. There's going to, dare I speak about reversed racism? But I think that sort of thing does occur. Is it in the best interest of the community? That I can't say. That's up to the voters.
It is up to the voters.
And so at this point, do you envision any sort of joint appearances with the congressman?
At this point, I have nothing. I reached out a little bit, but I have not heard back from him.
Are there any Republicans who are going to be campaigning for you, or is there anything any help that you're getting?
I'm getting some slight help at the committee level. I'm hoping to do better at the at the city when I go in there next Wednesday.
Did you say you ran against Gephardt in 1998?
I ran against Gephardt in '98 in the Democratic primary.
Oh,
and
okay.
This was in the 3rd district. Yeah,
right, 3rd district, and I got
the old 3rd district.
I got essentially the I hate Gephardt vote, which every candidate who had run against him for the past 10 years.
So was that
had.
like 20%, 30%?
It was about 25, 26.
Yeah.
It was a lot of votes. It was very satisfying from an ego standpoint, but not really meaningful from a getting elected standpoint. And then I also ran in the 6-person race when Lacey Clay inherited this seat.
Oh,
from
that's
his father.
right. Yeah, I actually remember looking at that. I was in high school in Illinois then, but I have looked back at the results of past primaries, and I do remember seeing your name there. But the
It was
main
a dismal showing.
the main battle there was Charlie Dooley versus Lacey Clay,
Right.
Correct.
which
Yeah.
Lacey
Correct.
Clay won by a pretty sizable margin.
It was pretty near 2-1, if I remember right. It was about 28% for Dooley and 56 for Clay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it kind of just shows though that running against a Clay is extremely hard. I don't think the Clay family. When I'm talking about the Clay family, I'm talking about William Lacey Clay and Lacey Clay. I don't think they've ever lost an election, and this is going back to the 60s.
Right.
So they obviously know what they're doing
They
from an
sure do.
election
Well,
standpoint.
the father. I mean, the retired congressman, Bill Clay,
Mm-hmm.
was one, and when he was in Congress, one of the most daunting figures, and I mean that in a respectful way, that I ever covered. I mean, he knew, he had been an alderman. He had gotten arrested, for
Civil rights.
the
for
Jefferson
civil
Bank.
rights at the Jefferson Bank. He had credentials, and when he went to Washington, he really had some strong sense of what he wanted to do, and but he still kept his hands in local politics.
Oh, yeah.
But a fascinating man. I was in the
Very
Washington Bureau in the
fascinating.
early '80s for the Post-Dispatch. And I used to deal with him a lot, and fascinating figure. And Lacey Clay has acknowledged that he's very different from his father.
And I just want to add, too, there are very few political figures in Missouri politics who were in elected office in the early 1980s who are still in elected office now. He has been in elected office for almost 30 years now,
Lacey Clay,
going
yes.
back to his state legislative days.
right.
And I mean, obviously he's running in heavily Democratic districts. I'm sure that the Clay name helped him. But, it takes a lot to run for office, as I'm sure you're finding out now. And he has found quite a bit of success even when running against, tough opponents. So we got to give both Clays their due from an electoral
Absolutely.
standpoint. Even if you don't agree with them policy standpoint or political standpoint, the record speaks for itself. And I'm sure you're sure you understand that, having run against them before.
Yeah, I'm not really saying that they're bad people
Yeah.
and we need to throw them out. I think that's a losing argument.
Yeah.
Particularly with Bill Clay, that's a great man. And I like Lacey personally, but that still doesn't mean that that's the best thing for the United States or for the district. If we're looking at how well things are being served, a lot of people are telling me that they feel like Lacey Clay has disappeared.
Yeah. Well, this is why competition is good. So,
Yeah, and well, thank you for joining us.
And for all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. You can find me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. You can find Joe on Twitter at
Jay Mannies, that's JMannies.
How would we find you on Twitter or Facebook?
I'm Bailey, the numeral 4,
Oh.
Rep 1.
The
The
number.
numeral 1,
Okay.
right? The number 4. Facebook, I don't know my tag there, but I think if you do Bailey for
Yes.
Rep and
Yeah.
search it, you get that. And then Bailey for Rep, the number 4 again, .org is my website, which is, I take on about 25 hard issues and talk about them. Clay's website is a lot of pretty pictures.
Well, I'm sure that your website has some pretty pictures as well.
A couple of me. I don't know if that's pretty.
Well, the reason I exclaimed there is because a running gag on this show is whether people's Twitter handle either has the number 4 or the word 4 spelled out. We'll be back next time. Until then, so long.
Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.